George Washington's early life was marked by formative experiences that deeply influenced the man he would become, a figure not only of military and political importance, but of strong moral grounding and steadfast character. Born in 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia, Washington grew up in the agrarian world of colonial America. His father, Augustine Washington, was a moderately wealthy planter who died when George was just 11 years old. This early loss meant that George's formal education was limited compared to many of his contemporaries, yet he made up for it through self-discipline, observation, and a lifelong commitment to personal improvement. In the absence of his father, Washington's older half, brother Lawrence became a major influence. Lawrence had served in the British military and exposed young George to the manners, values, and aspirations of the Virginia gentry. Washington admired his half-brother's poise and leadership, and through him, he was introduced to the world of surveying, land ownership, and public service. At just 16, Washington joined a surveying expedition into the Virginia wilderness, a physically demanding journey that toughened him and honed his practical skills. It also instilled in him a love for the land and a belief in the importance of westward expansion views that would later shape national policy. As a young man, Washington was deeply concerned with reputation, honor, and virtue. He carefully cultivated a public image based on dignity and control. He copied out by hand a list known as the Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior, a set of maxims for proper conduct that emphasized humility, respect for others, and the restraint of emotion. These rules were more than mere etiquette. They became a moral compass that guided his interactions and helped him rise socially and politically in a stratified colonial society. Washington's attention to personal conduct set him apart from many peers and earned him a reputation as a man of integrity even in his youth. Military experience came early in his life and also shaped his character. At 21, he was appointed to a perilous mission to deliver a message to the French in the Ohio Valley, an event that would help spark the French and Indian War. His leadership during this conflict, including the famous but disastrous Battle of Fort Necessity, taught him both the importance of discipline and the limits of glory. He emerged from the war with a mixed military record, but with a growing sense of patience, strategy, and resilience. These traits would later serve him well during the Revolutionary War, when persistence and long-term vision were more crucial than flashy victories. Washington's early life also revealed his ability to learn from failure and adapt. He made mistakes militarily, financially, and socially, but never let them define him. He used each experience to refine his judgment and sense of responsibility. Over time, this adaptability and self-mastery earned him a place in Virginia's House of Burgesses, elevated his status among colonial elites, and prepared him for the far greater leadership roles he would later assume. In sum, George Washington's early years were not marked by privilege or precocious genius, but by steady growth, deep reflection, and a relentless pursuit of honor and duty. These foundational experiences helped to forge the quiet strength, moral clarity, and sense of service that would become hallmarks of his leadership in both war and peace. His transformation from a young Virginian planter to a revered national figure began long before he ever stepped onto a battlefield, rooted in the lessons of youth, the trials of frontier life, and the cultivation of a principled character. While George Washington is best known for his leadership during the American Revolution and his role as the first President of the United States, his life as a farmer and entrepreneur is equally revealing of his intelligence, innovation, and forward-thinking nature. At his Mount Vernon estate, Washington oversaw a vast agricultural operation that spanned over 8,000 acres, divided into several farms. His approach to farming evolved significantly over the years, reflecting his willingness to adapt, experiment, and embrace modern techniques in pursuit of sustainability and productivity. Initially, Washington grew tobacco, which was the dominant cash crop in Virginia at the time. However, he soon recognized its long-term unsustainability. Tobacco exhausted the soil, demanded intensive labor, and was highly dependent on uncertain markets in Britain. When he found himself increasingly frustrated by poor yields and the financial control British merchants held over the crop's export, Washington made a major shift. He transitioned Mount Vernon's operations from tobacco to a more diversified and environmentally sustainable farming system that included wheat, corn, barley, and livestock. This was not a common move among his contemporaries, but Washington believed it was necessary for the long-term viability of his estate. Washington was methodical in his experimentation. He kept detailed records of crop rotations, weather patterns, and soil conditions. He explored new crops like clover and alfalfa to restore soil fertility and experimented with innovative plowing techniques and fertilizers. His journals reveal a man deeply engaged with the science of agriculture, who corresponded with other forward-thinking farmers in both America and Europe. He built one of the first treading barns in America, a 16-sided structure designed to thresh grain more efficiently and protect it from weather damage. This kind of innovation showed how seriously Washington approached farming not just as a necessity, but as a craft worthy of study and improvement. Beyond agriculture, Washington proved to be an astute businessman. He established fisheries on the Potomac River, where his workers harvested hundreds of thousands of fish annually for local use and export. He also operated a whiskey distillery, which became one of the largest in the country by the late 1790. Far from viewing Mount Vernon as a passive source of wealth, Washington turned it into a dynamic enterprise that supported a wide range of industries and employed a complex system of labor, including skilled artisans, indentured servants, and enslaved people. Washington's entrepreneurship extended to his understanding of American self-reliance. His shift away from tobacco and dependence on British trade was not just an economic decision, it was also a political one. He envisioned a nation of independent landowners, capable of sustaining themselves and their communities through agriculture and domestic industry. He promoted American manufacturing and believed strongly in the economic health of the young republic through internal development rather than reliance on foreign imports. Yet it is also important to acknowledge that Washington's agricultural and business success was built on the labor of enslaved people. Hundreds of men, women, and children toiled at Mount Vernon without freedom or fair compensation. Washington's personal wealth and business ventures were inextricably linked to this exploitation, even as he came to have conflicted views on slavery later in life. He eventually took steps to arrange for the emancipation of the enslaved people he personally owned, but only after his death. Still, the picture of George Washington as an innovative farmer and entrepreneur adds crucial dimension to our understanding of him. He was not merely a general or a statesman, but a man deeply committed to the land, to experimentation, and to the idea of economic independence as a cornerstone of liberty. His efforts at Mount Vernon reflected the same qualities that made him a successful leader: pragmatism, curiosity, vision, and a deep sense of responsibility. These lesser-known aspects of his life reveal a man who, in many ways, anticipated the American spirit of ingenuity and industry long before the country fully came into being. George Washington's rise to leadership was not driven by ambition or a hunger for power, but rather by a profound sense of duty and responsibility, characteristics that made him a truly reluctant leader. Throughout his life, he consistently demonstrated a resistance to personal aggrandizement, even as his peers and the broader public came to see him as indispensable to the nation's survival and progress. This reluctance did not stem from insecurity or lack of confidence. Instead, it reflected a deep humility and an understanding of the heavy burdens that true leadership entails. During the early stages of the American Revolution, The Continental Congress was in desperate need of a commanding figure who could unite the colonies and lead a disparate and under-equipped military force. Washington, despite having never commanded a large army in the field, was chosen for this role in part due to his military experience during the French and Indian War, but more importantly because of his reputation for integrity, restraint, and dedication to the colonial cause. He did not campaign for the position. In fact, upon his appointment in 1775, Washington expressed discomfort and concern about his own qualifications. He pledged to serve without a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered, a gesture that further demonstrated his desire to serve rather than profit. Throughout the Revolutionary War, Washington's leadership was marked by a steady hand, strategic patience, and the ability to inspire loyalty under the harshest conditions. He endured with his troops through brutal winters, most famously at Valley Forge, and often found himself managing not just battlefield tactics, but also the politics of a fragile coalition of states and a sometimes disorganized Congress. His authority was not maintained by force or charisma alone, but by a consistent example of personal sacrifice and ethical conduct. While many around him suffered from pride, infighting, or opportunism, Washington remained focused on the greater good, never seeking to use his military status to influence civilian government. When the war finally ended in 1783, Washington once again displayed his reluctance to hold on to power. In what was perhaps one of the most significant moments in early American history, he voluntarily resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to private life at Mount Vernon. This act was revolutionary in itself, defying the pattern seen throughout history where victorious generals often seized political power. His decision was so remarkable that King George Roman III reportedly said that if Washington relinquished power, he would be the greatest man in the world. But the call to leadership would come again. During the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Washington was once more called upon to lend his credibility and wisdom to a divided and struggling nation. Reluctantly, he agreed to serve as president of the convention, and later, despite his desire to remain in retirement, he was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. As president, he accepted the role with hesitation, aware of the enormous responsibility and the lack of precedent. Nevertheless, he committed himself to the office, setting standards of conduct, neutrality, and service that would shape the presidency for generations. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms further solidified his image as a reluctant leader who understood that power must be limited and leadership must be rooted in service rather than entitlement. By walking away from the presidency in 1797, he cemented the principle of peaceful transition of power, a cornerstone of American democracy. In every phase of his public life, Washington exemplified the ideal that leadership is a burden to be borne, not a prize to be claimed. His reluctance, far from a weakness, was in fact a profound strength that allowed him to lead with dignity, restraint, and unwavering commitment to the nation he helped to found. When George Washington assumed the office of the presidency in 1789, he stepped into a role that had no roadmap. The Constitution laid out the broad powers of the executive branch, but how those powers would be interpreted and exercised in practice was entirely untested. Washington, acutely aware that his every move would establish patterns for future presidents, approached the position with solemn caution, integrity, and a deep sense of national responsibility. His presidency became a laboratory for American governance, and the standards he set would define the office for generations. From the outset, Washington understood the symbolic and practical weight of his new position. He carefully crafted his public image to reflect the dignity and neutrality expected of a national leader. Even seemingly minor choices, like the style of address for the president, were deliberate. Though some advocated for royal-sounding titles, Washington insisted on being called simply Mr. President, reinforcing the Republican character of the new government and distancing the office from monarchical traditions. This small but powerful decision established a tone of humility and accessibility in American executive leadership. Washington also navigated uncharted territory in the formation of his cabinet. The Constitution did not specifically mandate a cabinet of advisors, but recognizing the need for trusted counsel, Washington appointed key figures such as Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. His willingness to listen to differing viewpoints, even as tensions brewed between Jefferson and Hamilton, demonstrated his commitment to balance and institutional stability. His cabinet structure would become a permanent fixture of the executive branch, and his practice of regularly consulting with advisors reinforced the idea that the president, while powerful, should govern collaboratively. In foreign policy, Washington's decisions were foundational. His proclamation of neutrality during the conflict between Britain and France in the 1790s helped define the principle of non-entanglement in European wars, a stance that influenced American diplomacy well into the 20th century. Though controversial at the time, his neutrality policy demonstrated his long-term thinking and prioritization of national interest over partisan or ideological allegiance. His restraint in foreign affairs emphasized that the young nation should focus on internal growth and stability rather than get drawn into the turbulence of global power struggles. Perhaps most significant was Washington's voluntary departure from office after 2 terms. At a time when lifelong rule was the norm elsewhere in the world, Washington's refusal to seek a 3rd term affirmed his belief in Republican ideals and set a precedent for limited executive power. This decision was a direct rebuke to authoritarianism and served as a powerful model for future leaders. His farewell address, published in 1796, further underscored his vision for the Republic. In it, he warned against political factionalism, foreign entanglements, and the dangers of sectionalism. While not legally binding, his advice echoed through the centuries as a foundational document of American political philosophy. Washington's presidency also gave practical form to abstract constitutional principles. He exercised the veto sparingly, respected the autonomy of Congress, and upheld the independence of the judiciary. When the Whiskey Rebellion challenged federal authority, he personally led troops to suppress the uprising, demonstrating that the federal government had both the right and the responsibility to enforce its laws. Yet even in this, he acted with caution and concern for civil liberties. In everything he did as president, Washington understood that he was not merely governing a country, he was shaping the character of its government. His actions created enduring precedents for leadership, accountability, and public service. Far from a passive figurehead, he was an active architect of the presidency, but one who refused to let power define him. Instead, he defined the power by exercising it with humility, foresight, and a profound dedication to the democratic experiment he had helped bring to life. George Washington's relationship with slavery presents one of the most morally complex and deeply troubling aspects of his legacy. As a man who spoke passionately about liberty, freedom, and the rights of individuals, Washington's position as a large-scale enslaver at Mount Vernon reveals a stark contradiction between the ideals he helped establish for the United States and the realities of his personal and economic life. Understanding his evolving views on slavery is essential to grappling with the full measure of the man, as well as the founding era's entanglement with this institution. From a young age, Washington inherited enslaved people through his family and increased his holdings significantly through marriage to Martha Custis, whose dowry included a large number of enslaved laborers. By the height of his wealth, over 3 100 enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked at Mount Vernon. They were integral to his estate's operations, performing labor in the fields, workshops, kitchens, and living quarters. Their forced labor contributed greatly to Washington's economic success, and for many years he, like other Virginia planters, accepted the institution as part of the societal norm. However, there is substantial evidence that Washington's views on slavery began to shift over time, particularly during and after the Revolutionary War. The ideals of liberty and equality that fueled the independence movement undoubtedly challenged his thinking, especially as he fought alongside African American soldiers and witnessed the contradictions in fighting for freedom while owning other human beings. Letters from this period show a man increasingly uncomfortable with slavery, though still cautious and guarded in how he acted on these concerns. He spoke privately of his desire to see slavery abolished gradually, fearing that immediate emancipation would lead to chaos and economic collapse. Yet he rarely took a public stand, concerned about the political and social backlash such a position might cause in the deeply divided new nation. Washington's most significant action came later in life. In a highly unusual move for a man of his status and era, he arranged for the emancipation of the enslaved people he personally owned in his will. He was the only founding father to do so. His will stipulated that the enslaved people he owned outright would be freed upon the death of his wife, Martha. Furthermore, he required that the young and elderly among them be supported and educated at the estate's expense. While this decision was morally commendable and courageous for its time, it must be acknowledged that it applied only to the enslaved people he legally owned, not to those belonging to the Custee's estate, which remained under Martha's family's control and were not emancipated. Despite this gesture, Washington never advocated publicly for abolition or challenged the institution of slavery during his presidency. He signed laws, such as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, that reinforced the rights of slaveholders. Moreover, he utilized legal loopholes to prevent enslaved individuals from gaining freedom when he moved them to Philadelphia, a city with gradual emancipation laws. His actions in this regard reveal a man caught between his growing moral unease and the realities of economic interest, social expectation, and national unity. Washington's views on slavery thus reflect both evolution and limitation. They underscore the broader hypocrisy embedded in the founding of the United States, a nation born in the name of liberty, yet built on the labor of the enslaved. While Washington's late in life decision to free his enslaved workers marks a meaningful departure from many of his contemporaries, it does not absolve the decades of human bondage he oversaw. His legacy, like that of the country he helped establish, must be understood in full, celebrated for its vision and leadership, but also scrutinized for its failures to live up to its own ideals. This moral complexity does not diminish his historical significance, but it does call for a more honest and complete reckoning with the man and the times in which he lived. George Washington's legacy is inseparably tied to his profound embodiment of civic virtue and his critical role in establishing the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power in American political life. At a time when monarchs and military rulers typically held onto authority until death or overthrow, Washington's voluntary relinquishment of power set a global precedent and solidified the United States' commitment to Republican ideals. His actions were not merely symbolic, they were deliberate efforts to define the young republic's values and ensure the stability of its fragile democratic institutions. Civic virtue, the idea that leaders should act in the public interest rather than for personal gain, was a core principle for Washington. He repeatedly resisted opportunities to expand his personal power, despite widespread admiration and the ability to do so with little opposition. After leading the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War, Washington could have followed the path taken by many military leaders throughout history who used their military status to claim political control. Instead, he resigned his commission in 1783 and returned to private life at Mount Vernon. This act shocked observers both in America and abroad. Even King George Roman III is reported to have remarked that if Washington truly relinquished power, he would be the greatest man in the world. It was a conscious affirmation that the United States would be governed by laws and elected representatives, not by force or personality cults. This commitment to civic responsibility was tested again when Washington was called upon to serve as the first president of the United States. Despite his initial reluctance, he accepted the role out of a sense of duty, understanding that his leadership would lend credibility to the new Constitution and help unify the fledgling nation. During his 2 terms, he was careful not to amass excessive power or overstep constitutional boundaries. He upheld the principle that the presidency was a temporary trust, not a personal entitlement. His refusal to seek a 3rd term, despite pressure and popularity, underscored his belief in the importance of leadership rotation and institutional stability. Washington's decision to step down from the presidency in 1797 marked the first peaceful transition of power in U.S. history and was an extraordinary moment in the global political landscape. Unlike many contemporary leaders who clung to authority until removed by death or revolution, Washington voluntarily handed over power to an elected successor, John Adams. This act gave practical form to the American commitment to democracy and constitutional governance. It helped establish a political culture in which power was not concentrated indefinitely in one person's hands, but instead flowed from the will of the people, exercised through free and fair elections. In his farewell address, Washington emphasized the need for unity, warned against the divisiveness of political parties, and cautioned against foreign entanglements. While not without controversy or criticism, the address reflected his ongoing dedication to the public good and his belief that personal restraint and moral responsibility were essential to the success of the Republic. His words and actions became a moral compass for future leaders and a foundational example of what it means to serve with integrity. Washington's embodiment of civic virtue and his precedent of peaceful transfer of power remain central to his enduring legacy. These principles have been tested time and again throughout American history, but the standards he set continue to serve as a powerful reminder of the ideals upon which the United States was founded. By choosing to limit his own power and prioritize the stability of the Republic over personal ambition, Washington not only helped shape the presidency, but also ensured that democratic governance in America would have a strong and principled foundation. George Washington's legacy extends far beyond the battlefield, reaching deep into the political, cultural, and moral fabric of the United States. Though he is most famously celebrated as the commanding general who led the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War, his influence on the nation's formation and identity is far more expansive. Washington's life after the war was marked by acts of restraint, foresight, and institution building that helped define the role of a civilian leader in a republic, all while shaping the ideals that continue to resonate in American governance and society. Following the war, Washington's actions demonstrated a rare combination of humility and statesmanship. His return to private life instead of leveraging his military prestige for political power reinforced the principle that the military should remain subordinate to civilian government. This act of self-restraint distinguished Washington from many revolutionary leaders across history who seized control after conflict. Instead, he used his immense popularity and credibility to support the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, recognizing the need for a stronger central government than what the Articles of Confederation could provide. His leadership at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was critical, not necessarily for the volume of his speeches, but for the weight his presence carried, giving confidence and legitimacy to the process. As the first president of the United States, Washington was acutely aware that every decision he made would become precedent. He approached the office not as a monarch or conqueror, but as a temporary steward of public trust. He avoided the trappings of royalty and maintained an image of dignity grounded in Republican simplicity. His selection of a cabinet, his careful exercise of executive power, and his consultation with Congress all helped shape the function of the presidency as a balanced and constrained institution. He believed firmly in the rule of law and in the necessity of governing by principle rather than personal will. Beyond his political role, Washington also influenced the national ethos through his personal conduct. He understood the symbolic importance of character in leadership, though imperfect and shaped by the complexities of his era. Including his role as a slave owner, he aspired to act with honor and cultivate unity. His farewell address articulated many of his long-term concerns for the Republic: the dangers of political factionalism, the importance of national unity, and the need for an independent foreign policy. These warnings, written over 2 centuries ago, remain remarkably relevant and are often revisited during times of national reflection or crisis. Washington also played a foundational role in shaping the economic and geographic expansion of the young country. He was deeply interested in infrastructure, such as canals and roads, believing they would unify the distant states and create a stronger sense of national purpose. His vision of a cohesive, self-sufficient America influenced later leaders and policies focused on national development. Even after his death in 1799, Washington's legacy continued to serve as a moral and institutional guide. He became the standard against which all American presidents would be judged, not just for his victories, but for his voluntary relinquishment of power, his careful stewardship of the Constitution, and his unwavering belief in the Republic. Statues, cities, and the nation's capital were named in his honor, not simply to commemorate his military leadership, but to celebrate the ideals he championed: liberty, duty, civic virtue, and unity. In the centuries since, Washington has remained a symbol of what leadership grounded in service and humility can achieve. His life serves as a reminder that true greatness in leadership often lies not in the accumulation of power, but in the wisdom to use it sparingly and the courage to surrender it when the moment demands. His legacy beyond the battlefield is not only a cornerstone of American history, but also a touchstone for democratic values around the world.